The first rays of morning sun bathed the quaint neighborhood of Maple Hollow in a golden glow, dancing across the intricate Victorian trim of Ava Reynolds's ancestral home. Nestled between rows of pristine beige modern houses, her lavender-trimmed gem stood as a testament to the town's ripe history, a home passed down from her grandmother, lovingly preserved with every brick and bloom. Ava, a woman of poise and unshakable calm, had spent years serving as a federal judge, known in courtrooms for her unwavering sense of justice and her commanding presence. Yet here, on the porch swing of her childhood sanctuary, she simply sipped coffee and listened to the gentle chime of heirloom wind bells, unaware that her next legal battle wouldn't be fought in court, but on her front lawn. That battle had a name: Karen Whitmore, newly self-appointed president of the Maple Hollow HOA and the self-declared savior of the community. Karen had declared Ava's purple trim, heritage rose garden, and antique wind chimes violations of their so-called vision. But what Karen didn't know, what no one in that neighborhood realized, was that Ava had the power to do more than resist. She had the power to dismantle everything Karen built, legally and completely. It was a Tuesday morning when everything shifted. Ava stood barefoot on the dew-kissed grass, humming softly as she watered the rose garden her grandmother once called the heart of this house. The scent of morning blossoms filled the air, until a sharp voice shattered the peace. "Excuse me, Ms. Reynolds," Karen Whitmore called from the sidewalk, flanked by two clipboard-wielding board members in matching polo shirts. "We need to speak with you about your property's continued non-compliance." Ava set down her watering can slowly, turning to face the trio with calm authority. "Is that so?" Karen smirked. "We've issued 3 notices about the purple trim, the excessive height of your roses, and those," she pointed disdainfully at the wind chimes, "unapproved exterior accessories. This is your final warning before we initiate enforcement measures." Behind her, one of the board members scribbled notes as if Ava's heirloom blooms were a criminal offense. "I'm not part of your HOA," Ava replied coolly. "My deed predates your formation and exempts my property." Karen's smile tightened. "We've had our lawyers review the documents. The neighborhood has changed, Ms. Reynolds. Progress doesn't wait for sentimental stories." Ava studied the woman before her, dripping with entitlement, thirsting for control. She recognized the type. She'd sentenced dozens of them in courtrooms across the country, but nothing could prepare her for what came next. That evening, Ava returned from the courthouse to find a thick envelope taped to her door. Inside, a glossy redevelopment plan for her property. It included mock-ups of a beige, modernized facade, a new garage installation, and a detailed estimate for the costs she would be expected to cover if she didn't comply voluntarily. The last page chilled her. "If necessary, removal of hazardous elements will be authorized for the protection of community safety." It wasn't just overreach, it was a threat. 2 days later, Ava's security cameras caught Karen and 2 HOA enforcers trespassing at 3 a.m., tape measures in hand, whispering as they paced the edges of her rose garden. "If we can't fine her into submission," Karen muttered, "we'll make her house a safety hazard." The next morning, Ava awoke to find her mailbox spray-painted with the words, "Join or sell." Her garbage bins were gone. Her mail was scattered across the lawn. But Ava wasn't rattled. She was activated. That afternoon she made the first call. to her contact in the U.S. Attorney's Office. The second was to a private investigator with a specialty in HOA corruption. The third, to her friend at the FBI, sitting on her porch that night, watching Karen strut down the sidewalk like a self-declared queen. Ava sipped her coffee and smiled to herself. Karen had just declared war on the wrong woman. The first sign of disaster was the acrid scent of smoke drifting through Ava's bedroom window just before sunrise. She jolted awake, heart pounding, lungs tightening as she scrambled out of bed. The faint smell had grown into a choking fog within minutes. By the time she reached her porch, her world was burning. Her beloved Victorian home, her grandmother's sanctuary, was engulfed in flames. Flashing lights painted the neighborhood red and blue. Firefighters raced to contain the inferno. But Ava knew, deep in her bones, it was already lost. The crackle of the fire was deafening, swallowing the sounds of mourning birds and replacing it with destruction. Windows shattered, beams groaned, and the purple-trimmed eaves her grandmother had once painted by hand curled in on themselves, blackened and broken. Across the street, Karen Whitmore stood on her immaculate porch, sipping a latte. Her silk robe fluttered in the wind, but her face was calm, eerily calm. Her lips curled into something between a smirk and a shrug as she turned to speak to her husband, who stood beside her with his arms folded, Ava's fists clenched. The fire chief approached, eyes apologetic. "Looks like it started in the attic. Maybe faulty wiring. Old homes like these." "No," Ava said coldly, eyes never leaving Karen. "This wasn't an accident." She stormed back inside the perimeter and pulled up the security feed from her backup cloud system. Her heart dropped. At exactly 3:04 a.m., the footage cut off. Every camera offline. No errors, no disconnect logs. Just blackness. This wasn't just sabotage, it was surgical. 2 days earlier, her power had briefly flickered. A technician, supposedly contracted by the city, had stopped by to inspect her lines. She now knew that wasn't coincidence. As firefighters battled the last of the blaze, Ava caught a glimpse of Bob Whittier's boots, mud-streaked and charred at the soles. The same boots she'd seen in footage from last week, when her rose bushes had been sprayed with chemicals. But it was the hushed conversation she overheard next that cemented her suspicion. "She'll have to sell now," one of the HOA members muttered as he walked past Karen's porch. Karen nodded. "That lot is critical to our development proposal. We're on schedule." Ava didn't react. Not outwardly, but inside. Something snapped. She turned, walked to what was left of her mailbox, and retrieved a scorched envelope that somehow survived the fire. Inside, another friendly reminder from the HOA citing safety hazards and upcoming redevelopment opportunities. As ashes rained like snow onto her front lawn, Ava didn't cry. She didn't scream. She picked up a single, charred piece of the purple trim from the rubble and tucked it into her coat pocket. Karen believed she had erased Ava's legacy with fire, but Ava wasn't done. She was just getting started. The morning after the fire, Ava sat beneath the charred skeleton of what had once been her grandmother's porch swing, the air still thick with the smell of smoke and ruin. Her hands trembled as she held a coffee mug that didn't feel like hers. It had been a neighbor's offering, a silent gesture of sympathy. But sympathy wasn't what she needed. She needed justice. For years, Ava had chosen anonymity. She'd hidden her true role behind gardening gloves and vintage sundresses, keeping her professional life sealed away from her quaint neighborhood in Rosehaven Oaks. To them, she was the eccentric woman in the purple-trimmed Victorian house, too stubborn to modernize, too proud to conform. They didn't know she wore the black robe of a federal judge by day, and Karen Whitmore had picked the wrong person to corner. As the remains of her home were fenced off, Ava began working, not as a grieving homeowner, but as a legal tactician. She called in favors from colleagues, activated connections she hadn't touched in years. Within 24 hours, she'd secured access to HOA tax filings, city zoning applications, and the incorporation documents of Karen's pet real estate firm. She wasn't just suspicious now. She had proof. But something shifted in Ava that day. She no longer saw herself as the victim of Karen's cruelty. That burned down with her roof. Now, she was the hunter. Her perspective changed the moment she reviewed the camera logs. A digital trail revealed the precise time her security system had been remotely disabled. The technician who had inspected her power lines last week. A contractor linked to a shell company that funneled payments from Karen's husband's consulting business. That was no coincidence. It was a digital break-in followed by arson, and it wasn't just her. One by one, Ava started uncovering stories from the neighborhood. The Wilsons, bullied into selling after anonymous complaints, flooded the HOA. Mrs. Lopez, threatened with daily fines when she refused to repaint her porch. The Tran family, whose mailbox had been accidentally removed until they relented and joined the HOA. It wasn't a neighborhood. It was a racket, and Karen Whitmore was at the center of it. Ava had once believed justice came from patience, from diplomacy, and due process. But Karen's game wasn't played in courtrooms. It thrived in whispers, threats, and manipulation. No more. Ava changed tactics. She filed a quiet complaint with the state attorney's office, knowing it would trigger a preliminary investigation. She shared encrypted copies of her evidence with a trusted federal prosecutor, under the table and off the record. But she wasn't just building a case anymore. She was laying a trap, because if Karen could commit this much destruction in the shadows, what would she do when the pressure turned public? Ava intended to find out. The judge had entered the game, and this time, the rules would be hers. Ava stood under the scaffolding of what used to be her front porch, now a scorched memory. But she wasn't mourning anymore. This was the moment she'd been preparing for her entire career. The law wasn't just ink on paper to her. It was fireproof armor. The opportunity came not from revenge, but from solidarity. Mrs. Kim, the quiet widow from 3 houses down, approached Ava while she sifted through debris. "I saw what they did," she whispered, her hands trembling. "I've kept every violation they ever sent me. My grandson said I should just sell and leave. But maybe I was just waiting for someone to fight back." Those words ignited something deeper than anger. They lit a spark of purpose. Ava realized that what Karen and her HOA cronies had destroyed wasn't just her home. It was every neighbor's sense of safety. This was bigger than property lines or purple paint. It was about people who'd been silenced by fear, fined into submission, and humiliated by HOA bureaucracy. So Ava took action. She organized a quiet meeting at the town library. No flyers, no neighborhood blasts. just whispered invitations and word of mouth. By that evening, 26 residents packed into the dimly lit basement room, and for the first time in years, they talked, really talked. Mr. Patel shared how Karen's board had refused to allow his family to build a wheelchair ramp for his mother, citing neighborhood aesthetics. Mrs. Moreno, a retired teacher, broke down explaining how she'd been fined $200 for hanging prayer flags on her balcony. "I didn't think anyone would care," she said through tears. "But you lost your house and still showed up. That gave me courage." Ava passed around a packet: legal resources, contacts for state housing authorities, and a simple draft for what she called a neighborhood integrity council. It wasn't an anti-HOA group. It was a residents' alliance, formed to protect each other, share resources, and challenge Karen's rule legally. People signed up immediately. Then came the twist. A week later, Ava's contact at the state attorney general's office called, "We've reviewed your evidence, and we'd like to elevate this to a state-level investigation." It was official. Karen wasn't just in trouble. She was about to face criminal scrutiny. But Ava didn't stop there. She partnered with a journalist friend who'd covered government corruption. Within days, a feature appeared in a regional newspaper. "The HOA from Hell: How a Federal Judge Exposed a Neighborhood Crime Syndicate." The story went viral. Suddenly, Ava wasn't alone. Emails poured in from across the country. People trapped in toxic HOAs begging for guidance, for hope, for a plan. And Ava had one. She'd start a foundation, a legal network to defend homeowners from HOA abuse. Free resources, pro bono representation, educational campaigns, because Karen had built her power on silence. Ava? She was building hers on truth, and an army of neighbors who finally realized they weren't alone. In the weeks that followed, something changed in Ava. Not just around her, but within her. Before, she had always been calm, measured. As a federal judge, she'd learned to master her emotions behind a gavel and a robe. But now, she was done hiding behind titles. Her home had burned, her neighbors had suffered, and her silence had given people like Karen the space to thrive. Now, Ava was stepping into the fire, on purpose. Every day, she walked the neighborhood, not to patrol, but to connect. She stopped to talk with the Wilson twins as they played basketball on a newly reclaimed driveway. She helped Mrs. Kim set up a GoFundMe for medical renovations on her house. She even joined Mr. Patel in repainting his front porch the bright blue he'd always wanted, but had been too afraid to try. And with every handshake, every laugh, every neighbor who stopped whispering and started speaking up, Ava realized something profound. She had never really known her neighbors. Karen had built fences of fear. Ava was planting seeds of trust. She hosted open legal clinics at the community library every Saturday. People came with paperwork, fines, warning letters, and she showed them how to fight back. Not with rage, not with fire, but with knowledge. One afternoon, a boy about 10 years old approached her nervously outside her rebuilt home. He was clutching a small drawing. "My mom said you're like a superhero," he mumbled. "I drew you with a cape." Ava knelt beside him, eyes misty. The drawing showed her, strong, smiling, standing in front of her house. But this time, the roses weren't burning. They were blooming. She framed that drawing and kept it on her new kitchen counter, right beneath the window where she used to watch Karen strut across her lawn. But Ava didn't let the winds make her complacent. Karen's trial loomed, and retaliation was always possible. So Ava trained herself harder, mentally, emotionally, even physically. She joined a self-defense class, not because she felt unsafe, but because she wanted every woman in the neighborhood to see her choosing power. The foundation she started, home front justice, grew faster than she imagined. Volunteers poured in, lawyers, activists, even former HOA board members who'd turned whistleblower. Her story inspired thousands to challenge unfair housing practices across the country. But most importantly, Ava learned how to balance the gavel with the garden. She wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. She was living it, breathing it, becoming it. The roses in her backyard, they bloomed brighter than ever, because now, so did she. The sun was setting over Willow Glen as Ava sat on her newly rebuilt porch, fingers wrapped around a warm cup of jasmine tea. The breeze carried the soft chime of her grandmother's wind bells, recreated by a local artisan who had heard her story on the news. The scent of blooming roses drifted up from the garden beds, where fresh cuttings from the single surviving bush had flourished into a vibrant sea of pink and red. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was a beacon. Across the street, the Patel family was setting up a projector for the community's first movie night. Folding chairs lined the lawn. Children chased each other barefoot, laughter echoing down the street. Mr. Figueroa from 2 blocks over was passing out cups of homemade horchata, while Mrs. Rodriguez, once too afraid to hang a single wind spinner, had strung up multicolored papel picado between trees. Ava smiled. This was the neighborhood she remembered as a child, before the rules, the finas, the fear. A few months ago, it had all been reduced to ash. But now, it was alive. When the news van pulled up at the curb, Ava didn't flinch. She welcomed the reporters with a quiet grace, answering their questions not as a victim, not even as a judge, but as a neighbor. This wasn't about revenge, she told them, looking directly into the camera. This was about remembering who we are when we choose community over control, kindness over compliance. The story had gone national. Her foundation, Homefront Justice, was now working with over 30 neighborhoods across the country, helping homeowners fight back against HOAs that had forgotten what the A stood for: association, not authority. Together, not oppression. Later that night, Ava stood beneath the stars, a small wireless mic clipped to her collar as the neighbors gathered on blankets and lawn chairs. She cleared her throat softly, and the crowd quieted. 6 months ago, I watched my family's legacy burn, she began, voice clear and unwavering. And for a moment, I thought I'd lost everything. But what I realized was, sometimes destruction is just a deeper kind of planting. Sometimes the roots that grow from ashes are stronger than the ones we ever thought possible. She paused, sweeping her gaze over the crowd, faces illuminated by string lights and hope. We are not here tonight because one person tried to control us, she continued. We're here because we chose to rise together to build something better. Not just homes, but belonging. The applause was thunderous, but Ava didn't need the validation. She already had everything she needed. Justice. community. And a house full of stories waiting to be rewritten. As the movie began and children curled into blankets under the stars, Ava leaned back in her chair, letting the wind carry the chimes into the night sky. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her heart. Sometimes the best legacy is a garden that outlives the fire. And Ava? She was just getting started. The story of Ava and her beloved Victorian home teaches us that power doesn't always come from a title, a gavel, or a position on a board. It comes from resilience, integrity, and the courage to stand up for what's right, even when the odds are stacked against you. When her neighborhood was overtaken by fear, fines, and manipulation, Ava didn't stoop to the level of those who tried to control her. Instead, she relied on truth, community, and the quiet strength of justice. She reminds us that when systems become corrupt, one voice, steady, prepared and principled, can ripple out and inspire many. Change doesn't always arrive through dramatic confrontation. Sometimes it comes through patient documentation, strategic action, and compassion for those too scared to speak. Ava's story is not just about rebuilding a house. It's about reclaiming dignity, one brick and one neighbor at a time. If you're living under an HOA that feels more like a dictatorship than a community, take a page from Ava's story. Document everything. Know your rights. Research your property history and local ordinances. Reach out to neighbors and build trust. There is strength in numbers. If things escalate, consult with a legal advisor or local housing advocate. Most importantly, never let fear silence you. You don't have to be a judge to pursue justice. Whether it's standing up to unfair rules, protecting your elderly neighbors, or helping start a more inclusive community group, you can make a difference. Ava's journey proves that when we hold on to what matters, heritage, honor, and hope, no HOA or corrupt board can take it away.